One of the things I wanted to talk about coming off of the last video that I recorded yesterday, the fast laps and races to optimals, was kind of how I was breaking down tracks. And the reason why I kind of wanted to do this video real fast is because normally throughout the season I kind of just fly through, looking at this track when it's related to this and that and blah, blah, blah. And one of the things that I've kind of seen, at least on Twitter, is that, we're kind of entering the NASCAR season. Everybody's starting to put things out, and I've seen kind of threads, and I've seen it a couple times. It's not just been one person. Just putting things out there to like, these are the track groups. These are how I look at the tracks. I forgot who exactly did it. Anyway, for me, I have a completely different approach to how I group tracks, so maybe that's contrarian. Maybe that's just how I view things. And I get to ask this throughout the year of why I look at certain tracks, and I'm looking at how somebody's potentially, how they might potentially perform at upcoming track. And I kind of want to just go over that real fast and explain kind of my process. That's one thing I've been wanting to focus more on this year. And I know I'm still kind of waiting for, the Clash to get closer, for Daytona to get closer before I start putting out dual and Clash content and stuff like that, because I don't want it to be just lost in the algorithm, not really being watched. But anyway, in terms of categorizing tracks and the track groups, let's go ahead and if you remember this from the other day, let's go ahead and look at track groups here. And like I said, I'm trying to at least put more stuff on the screen here that isn't necessarily the stuff behind the paywall, which if you want to support me, support Pearce, consider joining the Patreon below. Let's start with Dover real fast. So one of the things that I saw was that people were categorizing the tracks purely based on length or banking and everything like that. And I completely understand. I'm certainly one that goes, hey, this is a short flat track, this is an intermediate, blah, 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 this is a high bank fast track, whatever the case may be. However, I view things differently, and this is not me being like, I'm better than everybody else. But from my personal experience, I view tracks by how you would set the car up and what you would have to do to them. Now, I could be wrong, I could be right, this is my opinion. But let's start with Dover for an example. I think Dover and Nashville too, but we'll talk about Dover first, and it's not because they're both concrete. Let's talk about Dover. I believe that there is a lot of relative data that you can get from Dover to have a great idea of how people are going to perform at intermediates. Okay? I've been very aggressive on this the last 2 years, and I've explained it more and more of why I believe that Dover races like an intermediate track. Okay? And you can look back at last year, you can look back at the year before, and very quickly, we can kind of look through how people performed. But if you've looked at it, the people who show, and it could be different, or maybe not different, it might be more important to highlight now because we only go to Dover once a season. It's no longer in the playoffs. We no longer go there in the second half of the year. So Dover is really the second intermediate track that we go to each and every year, because we go through Las Vegas, then we go to Dover, and as you can see, I just listed the tracks. I'm not listing the second time we go there. But Dover, you got to remember that people might look at it as like, oh, it's a short track. Oh, not a short track, but like a lot of people like, hey, it's Dover and Bristol. Those are the tracks that kind of look like this and blah, blah, blah. And it's not. It's based on the load that the car has to deal with entering the corners. You got to remember that they enter the corners at Dover right at like 172, 171, 170. Okay, these guys are flying on this corner. This is not necessarily like a quote unquote short track. I mean, I know it's not a short track, but I'm explaining why. Like, I've seen it categorized wrongly, in my opinion. I think Dover should be looked at and viewed as an intermediate track. Okay, the amount of let me pause. Hold on, I gotta pause this right fast. The amount of speed that you carry at Dover, that you set the car up at Dover, whether it be Truck, Xfinity, Cup Series, whatever the case is, like, you have to prepare it very similar to you would at Charlotte. In my opinion, there's no difference in how you set it. And now people are going to probably pull up Brett Griffin or some guy and be like, well, actually, there's a big difference between what you would do to the camber at Charlotte and what you would do at Dover. I understand that. But in terms of the load that the car is, specifically like turn 3 at Charlotte, turn 1 at Charlotte, compared to, the G's that the car experiences at Dover, I think they're very similar. And we've seen it, that you've seen a lot of repeat speed at Dover when we look at Dover in comparison to the Coca-Cola 600. Okay, not only is it based on the aerodynamics of not only is it based on the load, but when you look at the surface, the racing surface between Charlotte and Dover, and I'm using this as why I typically look at Dover when looking heavily at the Coca-Cola 600, is because a lot of the same aero issues that you have at Dover, you're going to run into at Charlotte, and you will run into it at other intermediate tracks, because Dover is very much a one-groove racetrack. I understand that you can get single file, you can spread out, and the lane or the racing groove opens up. But in terms of what the air is doing, specifically, like if you're leaving turn 2 at Dover or you're leaving turn 4 at Dover, you're going to get tight if you're behind anybody there with that dirty air. Very similar to what we've seen at intermediate tracks this year, specifically at Charlotte. It was very difficult to make something work at Charlotte if somebody was right in front of you, because you would take if somebody was right in front of you, because they would take the air off of you. Okay, so like this year, when we look back, or last year, when we look back at Dover, Delaware, where we at Dover, you know, who showed speed at Dover that had speed at Charlotte? And the main takeaway that at least I was on last year, was the Toyotas, okay? And even the Chevys to an extent, because you had, you know, Chase Elliott win at Dover, you had Ross Chastain finish third at Dover, you had Bell, Larson, you know, Bell finished fourth, Larson finished sixth. And when you compare that to how they ran at Charlotte, now Chase Elliott was involved in a wreck, but he had good speed. Same thing with Ross Chastain. He ended up finishing 15th. But when you look at Christopher Bell, consistent throughout the month of, really that's the month of May, with the 4th at Dover, 6th at Darlington, 5th at Kansas, and a 5th at Charlotte. Clear speed at very similar racetracks. And I know I'm kind of speaking generally right now, but even when you look at Kyle Busch, 7th at Dover, showed speed early at Dover, just wasn't able to capitalize on that. Gets taken out at Darlington, 3rd at Kansas, 2nd at Charlotte. You know, very similar speed in terms of what Toyotas are bringing, in terms of what these guys are doing. When you look specifically at Denny Hamlin, fastest car at Dover. Okay, a lot of people forget that. You got to remember that nobody was owning the Toyota drivers and stuff. And this isn't just, you know, where was I right or where was I wrong? This is why I look at Dover specifically. Carried a lot of speed, should have won that race if he didn't have two major issues. He spun out, and then he had Cody Ware spin out in front of him as well. Darlington gets involved in a wreck. Kansas, finishes fourth at Kansas, wins the race at Charlotte. Now, however, he does win that race, and I believe that's a race that he shouldn't have won. They didn't necessarily have race-winning pace, because they started on the pole, quickly lost the lead, ended up running, you know, right outside the top 5 for most of it, came back to win the race. But for the most part, Dover, for me, I'm very easily categorizing it as a intermediate track. I think there's a lot of data, and if you're not viewing Dover as an intermediate track, I think you're playing it wrong. Okay, let's kind of quickly go through all the intermediate tracks, and then we can kind of go through a further evaluation of them. And so we would look at Las Vegas, Dover. Let me click that off. Dover, Kansas, Charlotte, Nashville, Texas, and Homestead. So these would be our necessary. I'm going to use different shades of purple. So these would be our, you know, classified intermediate tracks. We have one. Let me get that in there. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 8 intermediate tracks that we go to. And it makes up, I just went blank, 13, 14 races a season, somewhere around there. Now, would I look at Las Vegas to have a direct impact on how I look at Nashville? No. I mean, we're all going to take them in a grain of, with a grain of salt. Let's talk about high-wear racetracks and the fact that people just kind of throw in Fontana and Darlington in there. And I believe that we can, like, look at Fontana and view certain things that we can use at intermediate tracks. But like Darlington, yes, it's a highway racetrack. You know what also, you know where else there's a gigantic fall off in terms of speed, in terms of what a car does on a long run? That is Kansas. And that is, where are we at? That is Las Vegas. Okay? So, yes, we're going to keep them in the purple family, but we're also going, that's not aggressive enough. We're going to keep, I don't like that either. That's kind of bluish. Ooh, man, I really messed up here. What does this look like? That's way too... Let's use colors that are actually going to be easier to look at. Hold on. Wow, what a winning content this year, Brandon. You are absolutely killing this thing. Let's use yellow. Yellow, green, blue. Yeah, that'll be fine. Let's use yellow for these guys. So highway racetrack, Las Vegas, Darlington, Kansas. Oh, and clearly Homestead as well. You know, so these are tracks that I would look at if we're entering a situation where I want to look at a high-wear racetrack. I want to see where people are in terms of what they are doing on the long run. Okay, it is not simply just Auto Club and Darlington. Okay, Las Vegas, a lot of fall off. We're seeing that more and more each year. Kansas, we're seeing that during the long runs. Look at any of the races. This race is determined on long runs, and it's being determined because the field is spreading out so much. It isn't just a, Darlington's the one highway racetrack. Practically, yes, Darlington is a very highway racetrack because the asphalt is so old, but you got to remember that a lot of these places were also paved quite a long time ago. They have a lot of tire wear. Okay, same thing with Homestead. These are tracks that have a wide groove. These are tracks that have make sure I'm still recording. These are tracks that have you have to approach a race based on what your tire wear is going to do. You don't want to just have a short run car because you're going to burn your car away and you're going to burn your car up. All right, and so when we're looking at these, yes, I look at them all together. But, it's not just like one or two tracks to look at tire wear and things like that. Now, what I like to add on, and I've been saying this for years, is let's kind of talk about Fontana, Pocono, and Michigan, or Michigan, whatever you want to say. Let's kind of throw these in there under an orange, okay? The reason why I look at these guys, and we've seen it before, I remember this was last year. Somebody, some tout or something, got in an argument with a viewer, and then the viewer was like, "This is what these guys on NASCAR Twitter said," and they were like, "We never set our Michigan car up just like our Fontana car. We never ever did that." Okay, I understand that. I know. I understand. We're not saying it's a 1-to-1 replacement. We're not saying it's because they're 2-mile racetracks. They're similar. They're similar in terms of what the cars can do in terms of speed. Fontana, yes, tire wear is going to come into it. Yes, it's going to come into a lot of what the driver can do. However, you cannot tell me that a lot of speed that people will carry at Fontana cannot be replicated at other intermediate tracks. Okay, I'm not saying Fontana is the end-all, be-all. Let's not use that as our baseline for how everybody's going to do during the intermediate season. But when you look at the start of the season, when they go to Fontana, when they go to Las Vegas, when they go to Dover, we're going to see similar types of speed between these teams, between these situations here. Fontana, Pocono, and Michigan are great examples of where teams are aerodynamically, okay? Because at Fontana, really, outside of, the restarts, you're not going to be side-by-side with a lot of people. It's going to be determined on what you can do in terms of that car and getting through the field and just being based on speed. Pocono, incredibly difficult to pass, okay? We see that this race goes green. There's not a lot of side-by-side racing. Cars spread out. Who can carry speed through the tunnel turn, through turn 3, down the front straightaway? Those are the two most important corners in the track. Yes, you have turn 1, where you're going off along a straightaway in NASCAR, but really turn 1 doesn't decide what you do at Pocono. What decides what you do at Pocono is how you get through the tunnel turn and how you get through turn 3. Okay? Pocono, Michigan, Fontana gives you a great idea of where these teams at in terms of their aerodynamic capabilities by themselves when they're not racing with people, when they're not being affected by the draft, when they're not being affected by dirty air. This is why I categorize and I look at kind of all these factors when we're looking at a race. When we look at Nashville raced like an intermediate track. Are you kidding me? Like what are we watching? Why are we not categorizing that as an intermediate track? You know who had speed at Nashville? Chase Elliott wins that race. Chastain finishes 5th. Blaney finishes 3rd. Larson finishes 4th. Denny Hamlin finishes 6th. I'm going through. I'm trying to see. Harvick finishes 10th. Where's Kyle at? Kyle speed here. William Byron is involved in a wreck early. Kyle Busch finishes 21st, but when we look at how these guys are finished, actually that's based on, I need to look at the Dietrich data, actually. That's based on finishing. When you look at who was the best cars in this race, let's back it up. Sorry about that. I was looking at finishing positions. Let's look at where these guys were in terms of speed. Nashville, Denny Hamlin, Martin Truex Jr., Kyle Busch, Kevin Harvick, the best cars in this race. Actually, well, not, sorry, I'm kind of going all over the place. Best cars in this race. I don't want to mess this up. Hamlin had the best car. Martin Truex Jr. had the second best car. Kyle Busch had the third best car. Chase Elliott has the fourth best car. Kevin Harvick has the fifth best car. It then goes to Ryan Blaney, Chastain, Kurt Busch. You get the gist. I'm basically just going over everybody who was good at intermediate tracks, okay? This is not a situation where, Nashville's a slow, flat track. Okay, so it races the same way. Have you seen how these drivers are having to approach this racetrack and how the teams are having to approach it in terms of practice, in terms of restarts, in terms of everything like it? Nashville races like an intermediate track. Okay, that's just how it is. I don't understand categorizing it as anything but that. Okay, now once we get through kind of discussing the intermediate tracks, what else are we looking at? Well, we can very easily start looking at the short tracks. Okay, for me, when we look at Phoenix, there's a lot of variables going into Phoenix that you don't typically find at Martinsville because they're going a lot faster at Phoenix. They're going a lot faster at Phoenix than Richmond, things like that. However, when I look at Phoenix, I like to bring a hybrid approach to it and look at places like New Hampshire and look at places like Gateway. We're going to categorize these guys as the kind of short tracks in the blues and whatnot. All right, so when we look at Phoenix, when we look at Gateway, it's even said, when we looked at Gateway this year, that a lot of the teams were approaching Gateway in a similar vein as how they want to approach Phoenix, because that type of situation is replicated, or the load on the vehicles is very similar. Like when we look at Phoenix turns 1 and 2, yes, I know you have you basically go down the inside wall if you want to stay by the outside wall, but you know what corner is very similar to that, and that's Gateway 3 and 4. Okay, I understand we're not carrying as much speed down the back straightaway at Phoenix, but it is very similar in terms of what you're putting on the car entering turns 1 and 2 at Gateway and entering turns 3 and 4 at Phoenix. Okay, I understand it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but you can find a lot of similar things through that. Okay, when we look at New Hampshire, New Hampshire and Gateway, a lot of similar things to it. Gateway has more banking. You're going to be carrying more speed at Gateway, but a lot of things to take away, specifically how well you're able to get the vehicle to turn on the flat corners, which, hey, look, Phoenix has a very fast flat corner, which is 1 and 2. New Hampshire has 1 and 2, 3 and 4, which you're going to be carrying a lot of speed, specifically entering that corner. So when you're looking at the brake packages, when you're looking at how the car is loading, entering that corner, or entering both the corners at New Hampshire, hey, those are things you're going to kind of look at when you look at how to approach Gateway, when you look at how to approach Phoenix. It's not as simple as categorizing these tracks under a certain distance, or how banked their corners are. It's about what you do to approach it from working on the vehicles and things like that. And I would argue that even though you go slower at Richmond, there are things that you learn at Richmond that you can take away and use at Gateway, that you can use at Phoenix. Yes, you're going a lot slower. Yes, you're not dealing with as much power on the car, or not as much power. You're not dealing with as much G-force on the car as you would at Phoenix or at Gateway at full speed. But still, kind of the long entry into turns 1 and 2 at Richmond, because the front stretch is kind of curved and then it turns to a tighter apex corner once you go through 1 and 2. And then you also need to not get tight and hit the wall to turn 2. That's very similar to kind of how you would approach turns 3 and 4 at Phoenix. I'm not saying it's a 1-to-1 ratio, but it's much closer than people want to admit. So you can very easily look at these guys together. You can very easily look at this stuff. Now, yes, why have I not written down Martinsville? Okay, Martinsville is a place that I would look at as its own animal. You're going extremely slow in the corners, going down to 40, 45 in the corners. There's not a track on here that replicates that type of abuse on the car that you run into it at Martinsville. Okay, the fact that you're bumping through the gears and then you have to absolutely slam the brakes, so you run the most aggressive brake package that you're going to run in the Cup Series at Martinsville, which is very similar to the road courses, and that's where I look at people who have had success at road courses, and more specifically the slower road courses and some of the more specific corners at road courses. So when we look at Martinsville and we look at tracks that I want to look at in terms of being very precise road courses and stuff, to where you don't have a lot of runoff room, you're not taking a ton of fast corners through everything. We can look at how the people do at the Roval. We can look at how people do at Sonoma. I understand you're having a lot of speed through the S's, heading down towards pit lane at Sonoma, but most of those corners, you're approaching in a similar vein to how you would Martinsville. Let's kind of just bump these here. We'll put these under, say like an orange. We already have orange. We're gonna use a green for the road courses here, or how I would look at these guys here. Coda has some corners that are absolutely slow, killer slow. However, the more the elevation changes, it's I don't think it's as replicatable, or being able to do a one-to-one comparison between Coda, Martinsville, Sonoma, places like that. Like Sonoma, and Indy too. Let me include Indy here, because Indy has some pretty, not slowish corners, but it really depends on what the car is doing. You know, like the suspension package that you bring to Coda is nowhere near the same that you're bringing to Martinsville, because you're having to deal with much more elevation changes. You're having to deal with much more body roll and what the car is going to do at Coda versus Martinsville. Okay, but what that car is doing at Martinsville, I would argue that you can see glimpses of that at the Roval. You can see glimpses at that at Sonoma and things like that. Okay, now when we're looking at high speed road courses, the ones that you're carrying more speed, going back to the suspension, how those cars are loading, how they're unloading in the corners. That's when I specifically want to kind of start looking at Road America, Watkins Glen, Coda. These are tracks that have a ton of speed that you're taking, left and right hand corners, but with just a lot of speed. And I want to argue that Watkins Glen is by far the best road course we go to each and every year. Anything but that is just stupid, and the Roval is probably the worst one that we go to each year. Indy is also stupid. Stock cars perform far better, and they show way better racing at faster road courses. Okay, and this isn't the end all be all. I'm not saying go by this list and die by it or anything, but in terms of how I look at tracks and how I would approach a track in terms of setting it up and everything, it's much more than just using each road course or categorizing every road course as the same, or categorizing every short track as the same. Now, you're going to notice that I've kind of left Bristol undone. With my view, we don't have a track that is necessarily that I want to compare one-to-one, or that I really look at when it comes to Bristol. I usually approach Bristol, and thank Christ we have it later in the year, but I kind of look at it as a whole and then lean more into what they're showing off the trailer at practice and what they're doing in terms of qualifying. Very similar to, our kind of discussion in this last one of how many people are getting fast laps and getting fast lap points that are equal to over 3 points. Like, Bristol really is its own animal in terms of how to approach that thing. And so Bristol is more so kind of that's not great enough. I don't want to necessarily black it out, but Bristol's kind of its own animal and stuff, So when we're looking at intermediate tracks, from the outside looking in, don't be afraid to look at Fontana, Las Vegas. Let me see that. Fontana, Las Vegas, Dover, Darlington, Charlotte, Nashville, Pocono, Michigan, Texas, and Homestead. There's things that you can find that are very similar between all those races. As I said, you're not using the direct comparison between Texas and Michigan, or between like Homestead and Fontana or something, but you can learn things from them. They all have similar things that we can look at, and it's backed up by how guys perform throughout the entire year when you're looking at these tracks. Like, it shouldn't be a shock when somebody performs well at Michigan because they've had speed at all the other intermediate tracks this year, But when we're really getting into the nit and gritty of what tracks I want to lean in towards, and I think Kansas is pretty much a variable in and of itself, because yes, it has tire wear, but there's a lot of things that you can look at Kansas that you are most definitely going to take to Charlotte, that you are most definitely going to take to Nashville. Kansas is probably my favorite in-between track. Charlotte, I've said it years and years before, that Charlotte should show you exactly what each team has at intermediate track, specifically due to the length of the Coca-Cola 600. You can see how those cars are doing in drastically different conditions because the race is so long. Charlotte is by far my favorite intermediate track. Kansas is the one that I think we can pull the most data from and looking at highway racetracks, looking at racetracks that aren't high wear but are going to be very fast, looking at just intermediate tracks in general. When we're looking at short tracks and stuff, yes, Phoenix and Gateway aren't going to be necessarily one-to-one comparison, but you can bring a lot of things that are very similar to them. Martinsville and Bristol, just like I said, I would look at road courses a little bit more or a bit more aggressive when I look at Martinsville, but very similar to Bristol. I want to see what they're bringing off the trailer. In terms of Martinsville. And the fact that we go to Martinsville twice each year, we can really look back at the first Martinsville race and understand how these guys might approach it, might look at it, things like that. Anyway, I just want to make this video, kind of discuss how I view tracks, and it's much more, it's way more in-depth than just one category looking at each and every track. I think you can just pull a ton of things and learn a ton of things from each and every track, so don't be afraid to do that this year. You know, if somebody's talking highway racetrack, don't just look at Fontana. Don't just look at Darlington. There's a lot of highway racetracks on NASCAR right now, specifically with the tires that Goodyear are bringing. There's going to be fall off everywhere. And look for more data points. Find places that you can look at that other people might not be looking at. And going back last year, if you looked at Las Vegas, if you looked at Dover, Darlington, Kansas, Charlotte, you saw the Toyotas were gaining speed, you know, and then everybody else wanted to start playing them as the year went on. Their ownership started increasing more, but for a period of time between this, and that's why I like the month of May for NASCAR, like, you have to be aggressive here. There's going to be, between Las Vegas, Fontana, Dover, and Darlington, like, you're going to see a lot of similar speed. Be aggressive on it. Attack it before everybody else sees it. Before they go to a real intermediate track, and then it just lines up because people are only looking at, Kansas, Charlotte, and stuff. Like, there's just a lot of things out there. Anyway, thank you for watching. Thank you for joining me in this discussion. If you want to support me, support Pearce. If you want to join the Discord and get our projections, everything else that you get by supporting us, feel free to join Patreon in the description below, either under my name or Pearce's name, and I will see you guys in the next episode. See you then.